Welcome back to Lumon. We need to talk about Severance Season 2, Episode 1. There's so many juicy details that I caught in this episode that tell us way more about what we need to know about what's going on at Lumon, what's happening in MDR, what is the point of all of this, and what is the lesson underneath this show. If you're interested in all of the details I caught in Severance Season 1, that video is already up on my channel, breaking down the entire season, all the details everyone missed, and what a lot of things mean that people miss in Season 1. But now let's get into Season 2. I'll be posting videos for every single episode, so if you are interested, hit that subscribe button, like this video, because as a lot of you guys say, why don't I have more views with all the things that I'm catching? Well, it's because you guys gotta like the video. If I hit 500 likes, we hit the algorithm and we're good to go. So like this video if you're seeing this video right now, and let's get right into it. Season 2 starts off super strong, and there's a bunch of details in this particular episode alone that I've caught that explain so much more details that everyone missed. Start off the entire episode starting with Mark S. It's the first time his innie has woken up in the elevator since the OTC protocol at the end of Season 1. Since they stopped them, since they got the innies in the OTC protocol handled, and since Milchick tackled Dylan G. None of them have been woken up since. Mark S wakes up in the same MDR, the original MDR that we had seen before. As we know, Lumon is a worldwide company with a lot of different Lumon buildings across the entire world. Every single one of these Lumon buildings has their own severed floor and their own MDR. And this will become relevant shortly. But we are back at the original MDR, except something is different. Literally, the wellness center is gone. And I want to emphasize that the wellness center is Mark's first stop. I believe this is because he still feels the emotions of finding out that Miss Casey was his wife. The wellness center has literally been what almost looks like edited out of existence. They have completely took it out of the entire wall. It's not even them just repurposing the room. It's just gone. So this kind of speaks to not only how easy it is to change things in Lumon at the severed floor and how all of these rooms are basically expendable, but to the fact that if something really does go down, they can quite literally scrub it out of existence. As we see Mark S in the wellness center room, what used to be the wellness center room, someone is watching him in the background. Now, this person disappears before Mark can turn around, but he clearly feels a presence. So the question is, who is this person who's watching Mark from the background? Now, it's obvious that the biggest guess is it's probably the new security guard. Who is the new head of security? However, could the new head of security still be Grainer? We know that at Lumon there is some weird way where they're bringing back people who are supposedly dead, i.e. Miss Casey. Now, I want to be careful about the assumption that Miss Casey actually died. We know that she was in a car accident, but we don't actually know if she died. We don't know what happened or what Mark S in the real world, his Outie, actually saw after the accident, when she passed away after the accident, and what happened to her body, although obviously she was buried, quote unquote, but do we really know? Lumon has their hands in many pies. That includes politics, where they're lobbying for legalized severance. That includes the police, the media. It includes restaurants and all types of other businesses. They create basically all of their own things. So is it far-fetched to believe that a medical company, a biotech company, would have connections at a place like a hospital, where they would have unlimited access to people who not only recently passed away, but people who are in comas? I mentioned in my Season 1 breakdown that there is an article that reads that there are new scholarships being funded at Gans University with anonymous donors that are looking for female students who specialize in psychology and pharmacology. Now, pharmacology is another study on how things affect biological things like animals and people. But an even deeper version of pharmacology is neuropharmacology, where they study neurological disorders and how drugs and other processes affect neurological disorders like comas. So is it far-fetched to believe that maybe Miss Casey never died to begin with and that she's actually in a coma where Lumon took her from the hospital and they declared her as deceased? So keep that in mind as we continue to watch the show. But if people like Miss Casey on the testing floor actually are dead, then it could open up a window where Grainer could be chipped back to life. So keep that in mind. We do not know who this person is. They are most likely the new security guard, but is it potentially Grainer coming back to life through the severance procedure? Mark continues to run down these hallways and he makes it back to MDR, but he is shocked to find a new team of refiners. But before we even get any details about any of these refiners outside of this wooden statue that very much looks like the crystal statue of Mark's from season 1, we get interrupted by Milchick, who welcomes him back to MDR in this new fancy blue look with these blue balloons that have Mark's face on it, and he says it's been a minute. This entire interaction with Milchick is probably one of the most important interactions of the entire episode. And before we dissect all the information that we can get from this entire dialogue, which is a lot more than anyone else is talking about, I want to express that yes, Milchick lies, but it is more important to understand how he lies. Yes, Milchick will tell a lie, but that lie is always decorated with the truth. Like we saw in season 1, a lot of his lies were not completely false. They just were not exactly how he said them. And that is no different now in season 2. So even though we know Milchick is misleading and a liar, he is not saying things that are not important. Starting with what Milchick says about when the OTC event happened. I believe that this happened 5 months ago. He says that what you all did 5 months ago was one of the most painful moments in the history of this company. I want to point out also that 5 months ago is a quarter. Like the quarter system that they talk about in most corporations, and specifically in season 1 of Lumon, all of the time in their work ethic is divided into quarters. You want to meet your quota of that quarter and become the refiner of that quarter. So I want to point out that it has been an entire quarter until they turned Mark S back on. So it screams to me, what happened during this quarter that made you need him back? Did you guys not have a great quarter as a company? And it's related to everything that happened after season 1's events. Now, once they get back to the administration office, we find out that Mr. Milchick is now the new Miss Cobell. He is the new manager of the severed floor, and that there's a new assistant who replaces Milchick's old role, who is a child called Mrs. Wong, who we'll come back to a little bit later in this video. Mark S and his team were not fired. Helly R and Irving B both successfully made contact with persons on the outside, just as Mark S did, and Dylan G learned what happened after the fact. The 4 of them achieved international fame and became the face of the severance reform. Now let's talk about the truth that is decorating these lies. When he says Mark S and his team were not fired, he wants us to believe it was because Kier and Lumon decided to keep them for good reasons. But I believe Mark S and his team were not fired because it would look worse. If these people came forward and exposed Severance for what it is, and then you fired them after, that looks worse than if they just came forward and exposed Severance. It looks better if they keep them in control. So again, thinly veiled lies that are decorated with the truth. Helly, we need to talk about this newspaper and the article. There is so much important information in this article that no other YouTuber is really completely talking about. And I really want to go in depth into everything that this article says. So this is going to make this video very long, but hopefully you stay until the end because there's so much juicy information that comes out of this episode and specifically this article. Starting off with the name of this newspaper company, the Kier Chronicle. Now, although it's named after the place that Lumon is, Kier PE, which is named after Kier Egan, it is easy to believe that that is a hint at the fact that where the loyalties of this article truly lie, if it's even a real place, a real media company. Now, the slogan for this company is your trusted source for the goings on in the Kier and the greater world. But can we actually trust this source? I believe that this source cannot be trusted because of the Lexington letter. Again, if you have not read the Lexington letter, please go read it. I will be doing a breakdown on this channel in detail, so if you want to wait for that video as well. But in the Lexington letter, it is about an email that went to a newspaper that later on never published a story because Lumon has their hands in many pies. Now, the entire newspaper and all the articles on it are completely blacked out and redacted in so many ways. There's 3 stories on the cover of this newspaper, and majority of the Lumon story as well is completely blacked out. Is this just simply to keep the innies unaware, or what else are they hiding? Let's get into what they're hiding. Starting with the main article, Innies Blow the Whistle, with a huge blown up photo of our loved team of refiners, but this photo is clearly photoshopped. This is the picture that is on their desk from in the MDR office, photoshopped over a picture of JFK at a parade. Now, my question is, why does Lumon want them to believe that the current outside world is in the past? Why is this such a dated photo of them? Why is all the tech inside Lumon old? Why would that be? One of 2 reasons is that maybe the severance procedure is not as seamless as they would like us to believe. Maybe it is a lot easier to remind the innies of their lives as outies, and that is why they hesitate to let things look the way they currently do. The other reason is stimulation. If the innies are overstimulated by all this crazy tech, all these cool incentives, all of this glamorous food, it's a lot harder to indoctrinate them and make them believe in the Lumon system and rely on Kier. So there's 2 different reasons why all of these things would be as simple as they are, the liminal spaces, because it's easier to impress people who have not seen and don't know very much. It goes on to say that less than a week has passed since our 4 Lumon workers brought the notion of severance reform to the world's attention, and already the world has come out to say thank you. Now, although this seems to be positive and like all of these things were received, it is actually underneath it dismissive and acting like all of this is already handled. Now, it goes on to say a celebration was held on Saturday. Mark S., Helly R., Irving B., and Dylan G., the famous quote-unquote innies. Now, I want to point out that the picture said Sunday and the paragraph says Saturday. More inconsistencies where one thing is off. We've seen things like years, for example, being off by 1, names being off by 1, and now days of the week. This is something that matters. This is something that's important. Now, all 4 gave speeches praising the courageous acts of their innies and thanking Lumon for its accommodations. All of this was PR to fix the issue. The paragraphs go on to later say the board was eager to listen, other entertainers to perform, and then it's blacked out. A benediction was delivered by Dr. Rick and Hale, author of such hits as The UUR and These Values 9, How I Let Kier In. Now, a lot of YouTubers are saying that this book that about How I Let Kier In doesn't exist, and they're using it as propaganda to convince the innies that Rick and Hale believes in Kier. But I actually want to point out something that I caught before this episode came out that I thought, wow, this is actually perfect. At the end of season 1, Rickon starts to wear dark blue. I also picked up on in season 1 that there was a lot of weird things about Rickon that were closer to what Kier does than further away. Although Rickon is progressive and he's holistic and he believes in all of these righteous things, the way he practices them in the world is much more similar to Kier than different. Holding all of these seminars where he's reading his own book to people, making himself the center of attention at almost all times. Throughout his house, there's artwork of him everywhere, pictures of him everywhere, similar to like Lumon and Kier. Weird ways in which he's actually more similar to Kier than he's different. And by the end of the season, all of a sudden, he's wearing dark blue. I believe that we are going to see a Rickon who has changed, a Rickon who was maybe paid off, a Rickon that does actually write a book called These Values 9, How I Let Kier In. So keep that in mind. I wanted to point that out, that it's a possibility that Rickon is turning to the other side. And this could also play a role in why we think some of his friends might also be severed people. Now, the rest of this main article goes on to say, in the wake of last week's revelations, Lumon has begun implementing global reforms to ensure the happiness and safety of their innies. Blacked out, top of the line recreational facilities, sexual liberations, improved snacks, and the necessities for field. Blacked out. And the rest of this episode is Lumon's attempt to change the narrative, flip what's being said, and use propaganda to try to win back the trust of the public because it is affecting Lumon itself and the severance procedure. And this all starts to explain to you the rest of what's happening in the rest of this episode. Now let's talk about the mystery articles. Blacked out for the most part, but what they say tells us enough. Mystery article 1 says, Tuesday evening around 6:05 p.m., police were called to the Baird Creek townhouses to the apartment of blacked out, returned home after work around 5:35 p.m. He noticed the apartment didn't seem disheveled, but the sink in the kitchen was running hot water. Suspicious that a break-in may have occurred, I went to check on my valuables immediately. Upon examining my attic, I blacked out my grandfather's blacked out in the box. Upon blacked out, I began to scour, blacked out. Thief also managed to tapes he recorded, blacked out. During the police investigation into the apartment, detectives noticed that this break-in matches the profile of the Baird Creek Bandit. The Baird Creek Bandit has been breaking and entering during work hours, blacked out, being the 5th burglary this blacked out. Bandit is meticulous, blacked out, leaving nothing, blacked out, hair or blacked out, can't read the rest. Now, most people skipped over this article and thought that it wasn't very important. However, I'm giving you the details because this is actually extremely important. There is someone going around Lumon owned properties where severed people live during the work hours. So this person does not work at Lumon, who is then breaking into homes and not stealing valuables, but are stealing things that are important or maybe tell a story behind who these severed people are. Maybe there are even documents that relate to what's happening at Lumon, and they have yet to catch this person. So the question is, who is it? Who is this person that is going around trying to find things on people who are severed? And what reason do they have for doing this? We know that there are multiple different people and organizations that are against Lumon and the severance procedure. So who is behind the Baird Creek Bandit? Mystery article number 2 is actually potentially one of the most important articles in the entire show. Now, to start it off, blacked out, a scientific miracle made at Lumon Industries. Blacked out, this research is changing the way we recycle plastic waste. Repurposed plastic, and in a divine moment last week, science found a way to fix our plastic pileups. Blacked out, if this legislation we blacked out Lumon's plastic blacked out sector would be left blacked out toward the solution Lumon blacked out, new technology elevates, gone are the days of blacked out plastic bottle into another plastic bottle. Blacked out have the capability to change the composition of the plastic molecules. Blacked out during the process, the polyethylene C2H4, more commonly known as plastic, blacked out. The freezer cools the plastic to blank Celsius at this temperature, blacked out. Unlike a combustion reaction, this innovation safely separates the elements without releasing any hazardous gases, and the rest is blacked out. Now, this article, which talks about Lumon discovering a process where they freeze plastic in order to break it down, and now you no longer have to do what we usually do, which is repurpose a plastic bottle and turn it into another plastic bottle, but instead are separating the elements of plastic in order to turn them into something else. This reminds me of the plastic bin we saw in season 1 very early on, talking about Lumon Recycles. Now, what I want to point out about this that makes this article way more important than it even looks like is that number 1, polyethylene. Polyethylene is a chemical component found in most plastics and is the component that people use to create all types of different plastics. You could have hard polyethylene and soft polyethylene. But what is the abbreviation for polyethylene? PE. And what are they doing with this polyethylene? they're building all types of different things. So is this not only why the state that Kier and Lumon are in and Gans PE is in is named PE itself, but is it telling us that everything we've seen in the show, from the food, from everything that Lumon is creating, all the things that are being made in Lumon's image, the entirety of everything else in the state that Lumon owns, the restaurants, the bars, are all being created through this recycle process where they're taking wasted plastic and recycling it into other things. Now, this is where the theory goes even deeper, because what word reminds me of recycle? Revolve and revolving. Revolving like a revolving door, a door that keeps going in circles, a recycling process where something continues to rotate back and forth. We know that James Egan brings up when it's time for his revolving. Well, what does revolving mean? Is this some sort of process where Lumon is recycling people? It started to make me think about Miss Casey. Are they recycling people who have passed away and they're bringing them back to life? Are they recycling bodies of people who are being brought back to life using the personalities of people left in some of these severance chips? We know that when they got a hold of Peter Kilmer's severance chip, they called it, "Is this Petey?" Not "is this his chip?" but "is this Petey?" It makes me think that these people's personalities still exist within their severance chips, and that Lumon is in a process of recycling actual people, taking the wasted quote unquote people, the people who have passed on, and using them for other purposes. And this opens up the bigger goal of Lumon. I talked about it in my last video, so check that video out if you want to, because a lot of details on that the process of the severance procedure is deeper than it seems, because the real goal is cheaper labor. These people may be getting paid more than they usually would because all the people being hired here are low wage workers, teachers, professors, veterans, and the list goes on. So these people are getting paid way more than they naturally would be given based off of their resume, but they're obviously probably getting paid less than someone who works at a biotech company would, given their wages be fair. And this is leading to the whole name of the show, which is that severance, which in the real world is severance pay when you lay off a worker. And why would somebody be laid off? Because they're being replaced with a cheaper labor. Now, this cheaper labor can expand into like this whole concept we're seeing right now of if severance workers are slaves, which can expand to what? Child labor, which now we see Miss Wong is working at Lumon. So it continues to go on. And then you can imagine, what if there's a process where they can take people who passed away, fill them with empty personalities or personalities of people who choose to get severed, and now they have these free body workers that don't even need to be accounted for and don't need to be paid. I believe that this is where the show might be going, and through this process, they are trying to conquer death as well and potentially bring back Kier and the rest of the Egan CEOs. Stay with me here. And with that being said, we have not even cracked the surface of the rest of this episode. So I'm going to try to not make this video absurdly long, but it's going to be long regardless. So if you're still watching this video up until this point, I appreciate you. And let's talk more about episode 1 of season 2. Now, once we establish that Mr. Milchick has made Miss Cobell the scapegoat of all the problems that were happening at Lumon, and that they have made all of these thinly veiled lies about what really happened to Miss Cobell, talking about how she was trying to pursue Mark and had an erotic fixation on him and was trying to have a throuple with his Outie, which I do not believe for a second. Yes, Miss Cobell was strange, but I don't believe that this is the reason why. I believe that she knew more about this severance procedure, and that the fact that she knew that Mark's wife was at Lumon, she was really exploring how you could break through the severance procedure, that there's certain things that a severance procedure might not be able to control. So keep that in mind. Milchick also says that the other team members of the refinement team, they tried for weeks to get them to come back, but none of them agreed, and all of them said that the reforms weren't enough. But Mark's Outie insisted on returning, even begged, in fact, to let him back right away. Now, my question is, number one, is this actually the truth? I believe that there are potentially way more reasons than them just not wanting to come back for the reasons why none of them wanted to come back to MDR. But Mark's Outie, of course, wanted to come back to MDR because what do you mean my wife is still alive? But does Lumon know that he knows now who Miss Casey is? I don't believe that they do. Otherwise, why would they let him back? Now let's talk about all of the new characters that have entered the chat, all of the new people on the severed floor for this season. Starting with number one, Mrs. Wong. She is on her first day as the new deputy manager. And before this, she was a crossing guard. Well, what kind of crossing guard can a child be? Is it potentially that there's so many other rooms and places within Lumon we have not seen, and in those places she was a crossing guard? Or was she a crossing guard in the real world? A lot of questions that need to be had, but regardless, why is she a child? Like I just touched on, Lumon is expanding, and they're expanding into child labor after first expanding into cheap labor. Keep that in mind, as that is why she is down here. But how could they get away with child labor after everything that they just got away with and got in trouble for because of the OTC moment? Well, that is a question of concern. Is she someone who is not from the real world? Is she from the testing floor? Is she a child who may have passed away and they brought back to life to become a worker inside of Lumon? Now let's talk about Mark W. Mark W is from an MDR department of Branch 5X, where he worked with one of the other refiners we're now seeing called Gwendolyn Y. He thought that he would be permanently retired when his branch shut down, so this is a surprise. His team were dirtbags who never hit quota, not once, and he's very odd. He's very talkative, and he's a very cynical personality. He calls Milchick milkshake, and he has a lot of strange opinions, like how the color puce would make him puke because it's the color purple. Now, I want to talk about how everything he said points out the fact that there's clearly a shortage on severance workers. Why would they bring back someone who was clearly supposed to be retired from a completely other branch that was shut down? There's a severance shortage, and I believe that is the after effects of what our refiners did when they broke out into the real world and told on Lumon. Now people are refusing to get severed, and there is a shortage on severance workers, and so they're going back to people who are retired. They're going back into the depths of workers that didn't work out. They're probably shutting down other parts of Lumon and other buildings of Lumon and bringing these type of MDR workers into other buildings, including the very first one that we've experienced, the MDR we all know. Now, the other two refiners are Gwendolyn Y and Dario R. Now, other than Gwendolyn Y being a super curious personality and very interesting and talks about the real world and knows who Mark S is, she talks about how in her old perpetuity wing, the animatronics moved, and how basically a lot of their things were more advanced than the perpetuity wing we are currently at and the MDR we are currently familiar with. They are a newer MDR that shut down. And lastly, Dario R. He has a wooden head statue like Mark S's crystal one. He barely speaks English. His Eagans at his old MDR were brooms with plate faces and broom CPR dummies. This was a very poor and not structured very well MDR, but I don't believe it's an old MDR. He talks about how they had a rope instead of elevators. I believe he is just from a very impoverished country. Like I talked about before, Lumon is trying to find advanced ways to cut corners. It wouldn't be far-fetched to believe that they have some Lumon headquarters in a very far country where it's really run down and they're very poor, and they couldn't afford to have all of the fancy things that other MDRs have. But they were still trying to operate within these countries regardless, and that is where Dario R is from. Again, speaks to cheap labor, child labor, international cheap labor, and all the ways you can cut corners, because that is the point of severance. Now, this new Mark S we're getting, this angry Mark S, this Mark S with a newfound purpose and an identity where he wants to get rid of Lumon. This new Mark S that I really enjoy, that is a lot closer to his real life version than not. He stages an entire coup that distracts all of the MDR department so that he can get to Milchick's office and talk to the board. He tries to convince the board to let him have his friends back, and that is when we think Milchick sends him up the elevator to fire him, but Milchick doesn't have that power. So Mark S wakes back up in the elevator. Lumon needs Mark S, and the question is why? Well, this clearly has a lot to do with Miss Casey, which we get revealed more at the end of this episode. Now, when Mark S wakes up back in this elevator and the elevator's door open, the chairs are gone. He's on the severed floor and there's a painting there instead, what I like to refer to moving forward as propaganda paintings. We later find out that this painting is called Kier Pardons His Betrayers. It is very clearly a loose representation of our beloved refiners in this painting being pardoned by Kier after being stuck in the ground, being punished and put in their place. Now, there's a lot of Civil War imagery inside of this painting, and I've seen people connect the fact that Lumon was started in 1865, 1866, and might have a lot to do with the war. And this connects back later on to the file we see Mark working on, the Cold Harbor file. Cold Harbor was a battle that was fought during the Civil War. So now it makes me question what other files are named after and what they could potentially be. So I'm going to give you right now, because I did all the dirty work, I did all the hard work, every single file we've ever seen in the entire show listed in order. Here it is on the screen for you guys. So tell me what you guys think. What are all of these files representing? What are they named after? You guys let me know what you guys think, and I'll do a completely separate video on that. But we know for now that one of them might be named after a war. So keep that in mind as we continue to try to figure out what these files are. And at the end of this video, we get some more hints. And to tie this into a nice, neat bow, what was the Civil War fought over? Slavery. And what was abolished in 1866? Slavery. And what was founded in 1866? Lumon. And what did I tell you guys earlier in this video could be the potential point of all of this, which is cheap or free labor and workers you do not have to account for. Slave labor built off of recycling the people that no longer are with us, recycling their bodies using the severance procedure on the testing floor, and that they're refining these workers to make the perfect free labor worker for Lumon. The return of our favorites. All of our favorite refiners are now going to be back, but let's go over their return one by one. Dylan G comes down the elevator first. He returns and asks, did it work? So Milchick lied. Dylan didn't know what happened or ever find out what happened to his friends. They seem to all have not returned since the OTC event happened, but Mark was awoken first. He talks about how Milchick tackled him and cut up his belt, so we don't actually know what happened between Milchick stopping Dylan and Dylan waking up as his Outie. What else happened to Dylan in that window? The next person to come down the elevator is Irv B. He's still yelling Bert since the OTC protocol was called, so he has not been woken up at all either. We also know that he did not successfully contact anyone in the outside world, and he feels a way about this, so why would Milchick lie and say that he did? We also see throughout the rest of this episode that Irv is completely different and sad. It really broke my heart even when he woke up after the OTC protocol was called in season 1, and the look on his face, that feeling of finding out that he was this lonely man in a small apartment with nothing but a dog, and all the things that are about his life. This weird moment where he was living in such a weird way. It was a crisis of existence, and that really broke my heart because Irving was such a sweet guy in the severed floor, but it is what it is. We need his storyline. He's going to be a lot more important than he even realizes. But he's so distraught from what he saw during the OTC protocol between Bert having a husband and other things that he just needs a moment. He's going to the bathroom and he ain't gonna come out. Now, let's talk about Helly R, because before we even got through the rest of this episode, the moment Helly R came out of that elevator, I knew something was off, because when she got cut off, she was in the middle of a speech. So now all of a sudden you're not in the middle of a speech and you're breathing super hard coming out of this elevator. Something was not right. Then when Mark goes to hug her, she hesitates on the hug. The way she looks on her face is even strange. And instead of being happy to see Mark S, the same Helly who initiated the kiss in season 1, she asks where everybody else is. You don't even care that you're talking to Mark S right now. I immediately knew something was off. Now, before they can talk about what they all saw and they notice that the security cameras are gone, we get introduced to the new break room. There's a lot of things in this new break room that a lot of people missed. Starting with the obvious, we have a new, completely different looking break room. It is bigger and is very clearly built for a more softer form of punishment. Instead of that harsh military level torture we saw happening in season 1, they probably got in trouble for that. So now they have switched to this new method, something they have to do for the crisis management and PR of it all, but clearly not something that they actually wanted to do. Now let's talk about the artwork all over this room, because all of it is actually way more important than people even realize. There's a hang in there poster that's clearly a picture of Dylan G when he was hanging in there trying to hold the OTC protocol on. There's a grin and bear it poster, and I believe the person on the grin and bear it poster looks a lot like the person that is in Irv's article when it's talking about suing Lumon for injuries. Then there's also a weird B poster with weird symbols on it, so let me know what you guys think those are. But I want to point out that this B poster could be linked to the other protocols. There was something I didn't mention in my last video. When they went to go turn on the overtime contingency, there were all of these other things, all of these other different contingencies that they could have turned on. One of them being Beehive. So let me know what you guys think. Up on the screen are all of the other things that they could have turned on. What do you think that they all mean? Now, the other thing we see in the break room is a Lumon is listening screen. Now, this is connected to quite a few different things, including the intro to the video we watched later on in this episode, a video on the LinkedIn profile for Lumon in the real world, the fake one, that Natalie talks about Lumon is listening, but it has a much darker tone to it, and a few other instances where they talk about Lumon or someone is listening and watching people. So again, what does this all mean? Is Lumon listening to everyone? This is also something brought up in the Lexington letter as well. Go read it and tell me what you guys think. But clearly this is hinting at Lumon is spying on people, listening to the things that they say and the things that they talk about, and listening in on their lives, which then plays into the fact that yes, Milchick says there's no mics and there's no cameras, but are there really? Now, the last important detail about the break room itself is the projector. This projector with the big blue, red, and green lights on it. Now, in my last video, I talked about how important color theory is in this show, and I still believe that majority of the colors is pointing to the fact that anything in blue is following the rules, being a follower, being controlled, and listening to Lumon. Green also plays a role in this because the original prototype of the Severance chip was blue and green, and it's shaped like a pill. So similar like the blue pill and the red pill in the Matrix, the blue and green pill and the blue and green imagery around Lumon symbolizes someone who is being controlled, versus the color red, like Helly's red hair, some people's red details in their outfits, people who wear red throughout the show symbolize people who are going against the grain, people who are ready to rebel, and people who are trying to go against Lumon and have maybe even woken up, quote unquote. But shout out to Affection on my last video, who said that the red, blue, and green theme actually looks a lot like RGB, and that this was commonly used on older TVs and monitors and might be related to what's happening at Lumon. So let me know what you guys think about this. Is RGB the reason that we keep seeing all these colors throughout the show? Now let's talk about the propaganda video. Now Milchick shows the team a video that will be shown to every innie who sets foot in this building starting today, because they need to explain why they continue to bring back these specific refiners. Now it gives us a lot of lore behind the actual building itself. The Lumon Administrative Building Branch 501, which is where they currently are, where the original MDR we're familiar with in season 1 is. It has been changed since being built in 1870, making it the very first Lumon building as well, because it was only 4 years after Lumon itself was created. It is also considered the premier severed workspace compared to all 206 other countries where Lumon operates. Now, being the premier severed workspace means that it's not only the first, but it is the best severed floor. However, 206 countries, there's only actually in the real world 195 countries. So just like there are fake states and cities in the world of Severance, so are there fake countries. And this is where we learn that Lumon is calling the OTC event that happened at the end of last season the MacroDat Uprising. And through this funny stop motion video, they have kind of made a action film trailer of all the events that happened from last season. Now, this is all in an attempt to not only infantilize, but to bring a different light to what actually happened to Lumon, what actually happened with this whole situation. And they flip it on its head to make it about Kier. It talks about all of these bounteous reforms like new snacks, fruit leather, cut beans, Christmas mints, and salsa was one of the funniest moments I've ever seen from Dylan G. And all of these new incentives like hall passes, pineapple bobbing, and playful mirror rooms. Now, number one, hall passes now have to be earned. So that's going to be really interesting to watch throughout the rest of this season, as well as pineapple bobbing sounds painful because if you ever dealt with a full pineapple, those things are hard. So that was kind of funny. And all of these other new incentives, similar to all the things we saw mentioned in the article from the beginning of the episode. But I still want to know what all of the sexual liberations are. So we'll see how that plays out at the rest of this season. Now we see the water tower at Lumon talk, and then we see Kier flying again. Remember, I told you they go out of their way to make Kier seem like a god. He flies around like Superman. He has all of these stories in a Bible called the Compliance Handbook, and all of these propaganda paintings that refer to him as some sort of historical figure that is more than just a CEO. This is all propaganda and intentional and is all imagery of a religious cult. If you want more details about that, go watch my season 1 breakdown. But all of this is referred to by Dylan G as quote unquote a massive ass head game, and that's exactly what it is. Now, finally, after being left alone in the new break room, they all start to talk about what they actually saw during the OTC. Mark talks about how he woke up at a party at his sister's house for Rick and Hale, who he finds out is his Outie's brother-in-law, and for some reason they both know Cobell, and how just before he switched back, he found a wedding photo of his Outie's wife who died a few years ago, the reason why he decided to get severed, except the woman in the photo was Miss Casey. Irv says, then she's down here. Now that's an interesting way to say it. Then she's down here, not okay, but she's down here. I believe Irv is catching on very quickly to what his Outie was actually up to and might know more than even what we saw him figure out. Mark then explains how wellness is pretty much gone so that he does not know where Miss Casey is. But as we know, she's on the testing floor. Now let's talk about Helly R, because why is Helly lying? She lies to them and says that she saw the inside of a boring apartment where she lived by herself, where she was in sweatpants and a t-shirt watching nature shows on TV, and that on her t-shirt said save the gorillas. I think it's also important to point out that she lies about her Outie in a weird way where they're not only boring, but they're also progressive. She goes outside to find a guy who looks like a gardener and says the story was BS, but his brother was a cop and he would tell them everything and how she failed. And now this is where things get interesting, because Irving points out that how did you find a gardener at night? But I don't believe Irving says this in a way where he actually knows that she's lying, more than he's just more curious as to, wow, that's interesting. And we know that later on in this season they might figure out that she was lying. And that's where we come to Irv, who cannot talk about what he saw still. All he says is, it's not our world up there. That's what I saw. Now, everything he's been saying makes me so sad, because it's so sad to watch him have a realization of what's really going on in the world and what Lumon is really doing and what it all truly means. So it's really deep and it's really sad. But let's talk about what happens in the hallway. Now, while they're in the hallways where Dylan is trying to convince Irv to stay because Irv is completely crashing out over Bert and he's ready to leave. He's going through a lot of pain because although it's deeper than just finding out Bert has a husband, but also finding out that the Bert that he knows and the Bert that he loved is pretty much dead. He is mourning the loss of a lover, just like, for example, Mark S would be in the outer world. But Dylan convinces him that this is bigger than that and they need to figure out what's going on. And that is when Irv B opens up about this hallway, this dark hallway with dark walls that leads to an elevator he's never seen before with a red button going down. Now, eventually we are going to get to this hallway during the season and hopefully they figure out what's really going on. Then we cut to Mark and Helly having a weird interaction where Helly is asking him questions about his wife. Were they happy in this photo? And all of these strange questions where she feels a lot more removed from the situation than someone who has feelings for Mark S. I also want to point out that she has a weird moment where she says, "We are nothing like our Outies. They are nothing like us. We are not the same people." And this really starts to give you the feeling of, is this Helly R or is this Helena? Now, it could go one of two of either ways. Nothing in this episode is an outright confirmation that this is just not a depressed Helly, right? And this is actually Helena. But I believe that her way of saying this kind of hints back to how Helena said, "Innies are not people." Her weird interactions and her emotional removement from Mark S and how she goes out of her way to make it seem like she does not approve of what her innie has been doing makes you feel like this could potentially be Helena. Now, to quickly mention the Outie family visitation suite. Now, we know that there is a renovation that could potentially be coming to Lumon that involves this suite that Milchick shows Dylan G. He says not to tell anyone about it because it could make the other innies jealous. However, I believe that this is all a facade. When Dylan says, "I can see my family," Milchick says, "If you take the name of the room at face value." I believe that all of this is going to be is similar to like wellness checks where there was misleading information and facts about your Outies to make you feel better. This will be no different. It's just going to be film and images of your Outie family that you get to watch and misleading facts about your family and your past and your memories that you can then go look at, but it won't be him physically seeing his actual Outie family. And last but not least, one of the best cliffhangers of this show. We see them all return to MDR to start operating on their files. And Mark is working on a file named Cold Harbor, which he is 68% done. And then an image flashes on the screen where we see Miss Casey, and all over the screen is important information to talk about. It is still called Cold Harbor at 68% with an ID number, MP4, all these other numbers, which I believe is referring to the fact that it's video, the packet rate and the packet time and the duration, and that all leads to how long she's been down there. Now there's multiple numbers on percentages with bins underneath them that all refer to the tempers, similar to how the program and the data they were finding in the files is just the same. Then you see her vitals like her heart rate and her temperature and all of these other things. Now, I believe that this could be confirmation that what they are refining and what Mark has been refining is Miss Casey. Are they refining people on the testing floor who are flawed and need their tempers to be adjusted? I believe that this is a layered answer because I believe, yes, some of these files they are tampering with are related directly to people in some way, and they're also related to events. Like we know, Cold Harbor actually refers to a battle in the Civil War. We know that in the Lexington files, they refer to an event that happened minutes later where someone blew up, like an assassination attempt. Again, I believe some of these things are directly connected, and that what these files are just different ways that Lumon is using MDR to refine data on a couple different things and ways that they are removing anything that could cause problems for Lumon and their quest for eternal life. So I hope you guys like this extremely long video breaking down the first episode. I'm going to try to make a lot of these videos way shorter so you don't have to spend so much time to get all of this information, but I felt that the details and all the information I kept in this video was extremely important. Like this video, subscribe if you've made it this far, because if you've gonna watch the video this long, you might as well hit that subscribe button. Comment down below what you guys think about season 2 episode 1, what you guys think about the rest of this season, and I'll see you guys in another video.